you for joining us for this download, albeit virtual. I know we saw a few of you last week at ICSC in Vegas. And I wanted to introduce Brian Finnegan, our Chief Revenue Officer, and his team. We're going to kind of take you through some of what we observed in the conference, and also get a chance to meet some of our broader team. Everybody knows, of course, Angela, our CFO. Matt Ryan is the head of our South region. And what's interesting about the way we're organized from a revenue perspective at Brixmor is that we have our regions. Matt runs one of our 4 regions, who are really deemed the owners of the underlying shopping centers. And they're supported also by our national accounts team, which is run by David Gersenhaber, who cover many of the national and regional accounts as tenants, and Tanya Creekmore, who runs our outparcel program. And I think somewhat uniquely about Brixmor is we really forged a great partnership between the regional owners who are ultimately accountable for what's happening at the asset, and the national accounts team who are ultimately accountable for owning market share with the tenants that they're responsible for covering. And I believe it's a system that allows us to, year in and year out, outscore from a market share perspective with tenants who are growing because of that dual coverage. We have the local market expert who understands the asset and how the asset's positioned, as well as the national accounts professional jointly covering the opportunities as they arise. And with that, maybe Brian, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about the conference and what we saw.
Wait, just hold on one sec. We just need some quick housekeeping items before we go any further. Sorry, Jim. I just wanted to let everyone know that this presentation is being recorded and will be publicly available on our website for a period of time following the presentation. Some of our comments today may contain forward-looking statements. Please refer to our SEC filings for information about any related risks. And when we open the call today for Q&A, those on the screen, feel free to ask any questions verbally. Everyone else can use the Q&A functionality on the bottom of their screens. Sorry about that. I'll turn it back over to Brian now.
That's great, Stacy, and thanks, Jim, and thanks all of you for joining us today. We're again excited to share the feedback that we received from our retail partners at ICSC's RECon event last week. It was the first large-scale event in Las Vegas at its regularly scheduled time in 3 years. It was really encouraging to see the turnout for the event. It was roughly double the size of the smaller scale event that ICSC held in December, with ICSC reporting that it was among the highest percentage of retailer turnouts that they ever had of the deal making. And what was particularly encouraging about the retailers that we met with, most of them brought their full teams to the conference, similar to what they were doing prior to the pandemic. And our team really took advantage of that. We had 660 meetings over the course of 2 days. That was more than double than we had in the smaller event in December. And what we heard at the meetings is similar to what we've shared with all of you on previous earnings calls, is that a broad range of tenants continue to look to expand their open air footprint. And despite some of the headlines of challenges with margin pressure and inflation, tenants communicated to us that the store continues to be the most profitable channel to deliver goods to the consumer, and also that the reinvestments that we are making across the portfolio are being noticed, both by our core tenants, who, as Jim continue to grow market share with, as well as new tenants to the portfolio, which we'll touch on, and many of which we met with last week. So I'll give a brief overview of that demand, discuss in a bit more detail what we heard from tenants at the conference, and then you'll hear from Tanya, David, and Matt on their takeaways from them and their teams over the last few days. And then, as Stacy mentioned, we'll take some questions from the audience as well. So we entered last week with some high expectations, and that's because of what we're really seeing in the business. As we discussed on our last earnings call, we had the best start to a year from a productivity standpoint since 2018, and the depth of demand it continues to be very broad-based, led by strong operators in the specialty grocery, value apparel, general merchandise, service, restaurant segments. And really with those tenants showing a desire to not just open stores in 2022 and 2023, but we were having many conversations related to 2024 openings as well. We continue to see the highest level of demand within the outparcel space, which, as Jim mentioned, Tanya oversees. And again, that's from QSR restaurants, financial institutions, and medical uses. And Tanya will touch on a little bit of that as well. And many of those projects are featured within some of our larger scale reinvestments, which were prominent at the conference, both with new tenants and some of our existing core tenants as well. You can see some of those new tenants here on the screen. We had meetings with Sweetgreens, Camp Family Experience, and Tesla, among many others, who have really been attracted to the transformation that we've made across the portfolio. And then on the mall side, we continue to see acceleration from a number of brands that are looking to expand their open air footprint, and David will dig into that a little bit as well. Jack, could you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, more in terms of specifically from some tenants, what we heard at the conference, I'll give you a few examples on the slide here. On the off-price side, all the tenants, TJX, Ross, Burlington, continue to grow at a rapid pace. TJX in particular is very focused on adding store count to their Sierra Trading Post and HomeSense brands, the latter of which is making a big push into the Southeast, and Matt's been in front of them on a number of conversations in his portfolio. Ross Dress for Less is looking to expand into additional markets. It's given us more opportunities in places like Michigan, Ohio, and New Jersey. Specialty grocery continues to be incredibly active. We had very productive meetings with Trader Joe's, Aldi, and Whole Foods. Again, from a mall perspective, we had some great discussions with the likes of Sephora and Bath & Body. Bath & Body in particular is going to continue to open about 100 stores a year. And those aren't just mall relocations. They're also looking at what they call their shadow store program, which is putting an open air location in close proximity to a profitable mall store. And they've seen some really good sales trends out of that as well. And we've also got very active pipelines with the likes of Claire's and Journeys, Skechers, and Foot Locker. From a new tenant perspective, one of the encouraging trends that we really continue to see is on the restaurant side. We're seeing great restaurant operators who traditionally were in central business districts who are now looking to suburban locations. And hybrid work has a little bit to do with that, but they're also seeing where the traffic is going. And they're also seeing that consumers are demanding a lot more in terms of restaurants and services from the suburbs. So you look at some of the tenants who we've signed over the past year, like Chopped, Dave's Hot Chicken, Meza, and Snooze. These are all tenants that we've added to reinvestment projects across the portfolio. I mentioned Sweetgreens earlier. We continue to see a good pipeline of those operators that are looking for strong suburban locations. And then, Jack, could you jump to the next slide? And when you look at whether it's mall native brands, quick serve restaurants, service uses, they're leading small shop demand that is as strong as we've really ever seen, as strong as I've seen it in my career. And heading into ICSC, our team was capitalizing on that demand, attracting great operators at the highest rents we've ever signed in the small shop space. And that small shop activity has led to record small shop occupancy levels for the portfolio with a lot more room to run. I mentioned restaurants and mall native brands. We're also seeing increased demand from medical, optical, and hair salon categories within that service sector. Salon suites in particular has been incredibly active for us across the portfolio. And I'd also touch on the fitness category as well from a small shop perspective. We've really seen a nice bounce back in boutique fitness. In our meetings with Exponential and Orange Theory last week at the conference, they told us they're seeing class schedules that are filling up, good demand from well-capitalized franchisees to open more locations. And we're seeing that in our results as well. We signed our first deal last quarter with Exponential's Rumble Boxing concept. Some of you may be familiar with them. in the city. This is part of their initial expansion into the suburbs. And it's just another sign that good quality operators are looking to expand in well-located suburban shopping centers. So overall, I mean, we were very encouraged by the depth of demand for space that we saw last week. It's driving a lot of competition for space across the portfolio, allowing us to add tenants at the highest rents that we ever have achieved as a company. And as you can imagine, David, Tanya, Matt, and the rest of our team, we've got a lot of follow-up coming out of the show. So I thought we'd turn it to them at this point to hear kind of some of their thoughts on what they heard and some of the trends overall that they saw over the past few days there. And as Stacy mentioned, we'll then hand it over to some questions from the audience. You can feel free to use the chat button as well. So David, Matt, and Tanya, why don't I start just kind of what was the overall mood and tone from the retailers that you met with last week? You know, we touched on inflation a bit, you know, kind of how that came up and maybe the macro backdrop in some of those meetings. David, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of conversation about economic backdrop and inflation. What I would tell you that we heard from all of our core retailers is that the store continues to be the least expensive last mile method of getting the product into the consumer's hands. Even with the increased cost pressuring margins, the retailers are more focused on the brick and mortar aspect of their omni-channel approach. As far as store opening plans go, I didn't hear a single iota of any reduction in store count pipelines, period, in any of our meetings. In fact, a lot of the retailers were super outspoken about about the challenges they're seeing in getting space. For me, this is a first in my career that we've had this kind of width and breadth of categories vying for space, right? It's not just grocer or just off price, it's all of them today. And with that, they're having trouble filling their store pipelines. We were in a meeting with Michaels, who has 75 open to buys next year. They have a quarter of that full. Same thing with Academy. The specialty grocers were telling us, we need more spaces, show us everything you have, the Sprouts, Fresh Market, Aldi, Whole Foods, as Brian mentioned, of the world. Five Below and Ulta in that same bucket. Five Below is going to do 165 new stores next year. Ulta is going to do 50 new stores next year. And that demand is for assets like ours, where all these retailers are noticing the reinvestments that we're making, and they're all challenged to find space despite the headwinds.
Thanks, David. Matt, how about from your end in the Southeast?
Yeah, it was similar. I'd say, you know, to add to Gersten Haber's comments, some of the box tenants were asking to be notified if a deal falls out. So they all know who we're at least with typically, and they're asking about specific spaces. I want to be your first call if they hesitate to move forward with that lease. If they blink, I want to be your, I want you to let me know right away. You know, frankly, I was a little concerned going into the show based off of some of the feedback from Burlington and Ross and the week before, but there was no sense of that there. You know, very similar to what Gersten Haber said. It was, you know, the shop tenants were very active. The box tenants were all hungry for space. I'm sure Tanya will talk about the out parcel tenants. There was a huge demand for out parcels. The inflation comments were, you know, really focused around construction costs. We spent a lot of time with, you know, we spent some time with retailers talking about some of the costs that we're seeing, but they've been cooperative, working on work letters with us, you know, maybe taking space in either an existing, you know, in an existing condition, you know, working with existing facades to try and reduce costs, working with our construction team closely and their team to cut costs where possible, or, you know, where we can't really cut costs to take a look at rent and push rent further. So they've, I think they recognize that it's hard to find space. As we're looking at costs, stuff's getting more expensive, but the two teams working together has been really, it's been nice. I feel like we have a better relationship with the retailers at this point than ever.
Yeah, and that's specific to a couple of the meetings that we were in related to that additional rent. It was something that I think retailers were certainly expecting, and again, have been working with us on across the portfolio. But I noticed that in a couple of your meetings. Tanya, how about from your end? Just that both Matt and I have mentioned it. Just that demand within the out parcel space and competition within the out parcel space? What were some of the things that you saw?
Absolutely. And, a lot of it, I'm going to echo what everyone has touched on as far as, the supply is low and the demand is really high, especially from out parcel tenants. They did not do a lot of actual growth during, 2020. So it's that pent up demand to move forward. And a lot of the lead times on their deals are 2 years. So when they were busy concentrating on operations in 2020, it put them back 12 months. I guess the two unique things that seem to be repetitive in the out parcel world relating to Brixmor is they're gravitated towards us because of the geographic footprint that we have, but we also have a demonstrated track record of delivering. So that's been, it's a great partnership for both parties to lean on, both the tenant and the landlord, as we are dealing with the inflation and the increased cost and labor situation. So it's nice to have that relationship to partner. And then the second thing is that, we have a lot of older leases in our portfolio on these pads. I mean, some of them are 20 years old. So when they're starting to roll it without options, and the retail community knows that, the out parcel tenants know that. So it's an opportunity for us to, partner to increase the rent of an existing tenant, or if not, we do have that choice because of the competition out there to really make sure we have the right tenant mix from a merchandising perspective, and that we really do take advantage of the competition and make sure that we're getting market rents for these out parcels.
That's great. And Tanya, maybe if I get a follow-up, what were some of just the specific tenants maybe that you could mention that you were in discussions with, or specific markets in particular?
It's really all over. The Sun Belt is definitely very busy. However, we're doing deals in California with out parcel tenants, and the new Northeast, the Midwest. We really are active in every single one of the regions right now, in the out parcel category. Specific tenants are some that we've partnered with for a long time: Chick-fil-A, Chipotle, Starbucks, some of the banks. Although you're seeing consolidation, that's a positive to us in many instances. We're the recipient of some of those consolidated locations because of our partnership. We learn about those early on. And then there's some more regional tenants that are starting to expand outside of their region, such as Whataburger. You already mentioned Snooze. We haven't done a lease with Velvet Taco, but that level of tenant as well. And it's because of some of our new developments, actually, that's attracting some of those tenants, such as Velvet Taco, that are, like you said, coming from the urban core out into the suburbs.
That's great. That's great. Why don't I head back to David for a second? David, I touched on it a bit in terms of the mall retailers. Any additional color that you heard specifically in your meetings or from the rest of the national account team related to mall native tenants and what you're seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, the mall native tenants continue to be super exciting in our space, right? As many of you know, before the pandemic, this was already a trend. The mall tenants coming out of the mall, they wanted better visibility, better access, and lower occupancy costs, which we were able to offer. The pandemic just fueled that fire, and that trend has really heated up lately. I can list lots of tenants in this space, but I'll name a few that we met with last week. Just some sound bites here. Sleep Number's a big one. That's a 37-year-old brand who, when they started, they were 100% in malls. Today, they're down to 18%, and the go-forward plan is all open air, no malls. Sephora is another one. They're going to do 40 new next year, all in open air. Claire's 200 new. Brian, you mentioned Bath and Body already, 100 new stores next year. We met with Luxottica, LensCrafters, Pearl Vision, who is moving out of the majority of the malls they're in. And then we're seeing a lot of traction with the sneaker fashion category. We did our first deals with DTLR and JD Sports, all traditional mall tenants. Lululemon, they're looking for the best center in the market, and they would do a mall if it was the best center in the market. But given the reinvestment that we've been making across the portfolio, they're starting to notice some of our assets. And it's allowing us to attract higher end tenants like that. That Brian, that's pretty much the list of exciting ones that we met with last week.
Yeah, and what just to piggyback on that, Dave, what I thought was interesting, particularly in that Lusatica meeting, is we should have a lot of opportunity. They were going through just the mall expirations that they had coming up over the next few years, and we're saying, guys, we should have a lot more opportunities coming up, which was great. So we're excited to see that pipeline coming through. Why don't I just one more question for the team, and then I'll turn it to the audience. Matt, you've got a ton of reinvestment going on now in your portfolio, and as I mentioned, we highlighted a lot of those projects last week. Anything specific relative to the reinvestment projects that you're working on, or kind of broadly what you saw in terms of tenants discussing what we've been doing across the portfolio?
Sure. So, the reinvestments, typically we're adding a box, we're adding some sort of anchor to these centers, which is driving a lot of follow-on shop leasing, driving some anchor, some other additional anchor leasing, some out parcel leasing. Some of the projects we were able to announce or really give updates on. There was a handful in the Naples area, and Marco. That redevelopment is 99% done at this point. We're filling shops. We had a couple good meetings there. We're bringing that to a head. Bonita Springs, the acquisition from last April. We're recapturing the old time pottery there. We're at lease with 2 box tenants that we hope to finalize here in the next 45 days. And that activity has helped spur some additional shop leasing. I think we've signed 8 leases there since we bought it a year ago. It's been really, really nice. Some of the other projects in Atlanta, Village of Mableton is one of the last Kmart boxes we have. We were able to announce a Ross and a DD's lease that got signed there a few months ago. We have another box that'll fill that up. And that announcing that activity has helped us fill some shops there as well. We haven't even started construction on that. We're generating a lot of shop activity in the existing shop spaces. And then Spartanburg, South Carolina, Hillcrest, we were able to announce a Hobby Lobby lease, a new lease with Ross, a Five Below lease, which has spurred 3 out parcel deals that we're about to sign, and 5 additional shop leases, all within the last 6 months. So we had a couple meetings there for the 2 or 3 remaining shops that we have left at Hillcrest to fill. But yeah, the reinvestment has led to this additional shop leasing, and the meetings last week were really just able to propel some of these projects to completion.
Yeah, Matt, it's really exciting what you guys in particular have done across that portfolio. Why don't I go to some questions from the audience? And Craig Schmidt, why don't I start with you? Hey, Craig, I think you may be on mute. Anybody else? That's not where I can't hear Craig. Can anybody else hear him?
No, I don't hear him either, Brian.
No.
Sorry, Craig. If you can put that in the chat, I'll come right back to you. Juan, why don't we go to you?
Thank you. You mentioned Bath and Body Works looking to, in some cases, it sounded like doubling up exposure in certain markets between the mall and some of your centers. Just curious if you could expand on that a little bit and kind of how you see their ultimate end game with regards to their exposures there, and kind of what they're trying to decide between when they have exposure, 2 exposures in one market, which is what it sounded like you were talking about.
Yeah, so one, it's their program generally has been to relocate out of challenging mall locations, or where they can find an open air opportunity to just specifically reduce their occupancy costs, or where they see traffic drivers like we have across our portfolio. That's been the primary driver. What was interesting is they still have some very productive mall stores and some strong malls. And I think their message to us at the conference was, don't just take those opportunities off the table because you think we may have one in an A mall, because that's doing so well that we may add a shadow store that's not going to impact that location long term, but we think we can drive additional incremental traffic to that location. And we're finding that we've done 1 or 2 of them across our portfolio, but I think it was more of a message just to not take those opportunities away. The bulk of the opportunities that we're talking to them about have been relocations from, call it B and C mall locations. It was just another additional avenue for growth. And I think their message to us was those stores are producing the shadow store pipeline.
Can I just have one quick follow-up? Um,
Sure.
The occupancy cost phenomenon or focus, that's traditionally been more of like a mall concept. Just curious how receptive the shopping center tenants are to that, given the flow to e-commerce sales that aren't necessarily reported or being captured, and how that is evolving, if at all.
Well, I mean, just look, rent's a function of sales. And I think from a occupancy cost perspective, particularly when there's a lot of competition for space, and I'd love David to chime in on this as well, it's generally what the volume you think that you're going to do at the center and what you can afford to pay. As it relates to the malls, generally we still have a fraction of the OpEx expenses that malls typically have. And so we're at a competitive advantage. Plus, we now have a number of the traffic drivers in terms of off-price specialty grocery that as more of these mall native tenants have opened stores and started to see strong productivity out of those locations, they're expanding those footprints. Like sales and occupancy costs come up in a lot of discussions that we have, and it's simply it's driving to the best rental outcome. And I think teams proved across the portfolio that we're utilizing those discussions to get the highest rents that we can. David, I don't know if you want to chime in on that or add anything there.
Yeah, you nailed most of it, but from a mall perspective, there's a lot more common area. There's hallways, there's parking garages, there's water features, all those things these tenants are paying for. And to Brian's point, they're looking at their gross occupancy cost versus the sales that they're going to do. And in our asset class, it's exponentially cheaper.
And they're very aware of what a unit does both in the store and what it drives in terms of online business. And while we may not be able to, quote unquote, capture that in some kind of percentage rent clause, we're capturing it in min rent, right? Because that retailer is thinking holistically about not just what sales are going through the store, but what sales are being supported by the store.
Thanks, Juan. Thanks, Jim. Craig, why don't we try again? I think I could hear your keyboard, so I think the sound might be working.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, sorry. I don't know when I've seen people come back from the ICSC conference, retailers and landlords so positive, but I'm just wondering how many more big lots do we have where they pull back on their aggressive store opening? And I guess I'm more curious, how do they go from 50 stores to 30 stores this year? I mean, are people are they pushing the leases out, or are they canceling them?
I'm sorry, Craig, can you mention the tenant again?
I'm sorry, big lots.
Big lots,
BIG.
okay. Yeah, I mean, we have a
they just
handful.
announced that they were trimming store openings, and they had 50 this year, and they're coming to 30. They have 500 multiple years, but I'm just waiting to see. And I'm just, are there more big boxes like that out there, or how were they able to get from 50 stores this year to 30? It just seems like, you would have thought that would already been half pregnant.
Yeah, I won't speak for them in particular. I would just say some retailers have pushed out 2022 openings into 2023, specifically due to some of the supply chain issues that have occurred. And I think it's to Matt's point earlier that the conversations that we've been having with a lot of tenants are, what do I need to do to get my store open in 22? Can I work with you on the facade? Can I work with you on some of the existing conditions? So it wouldn't necessarily shock me that there's some, from an overall store opening perspective, that some of those got pushed out to 23. But to David's point, we're still seeing retailers, even though some of those stores are pushing into 23, we're still seeing retailers like Michael's, like Burlington, like TJX, Ross, that are still looking to fill that 2023 pipeline. So despite the fact that some stores may be getting pushed back, it's not impacting directly open to buys. They're still coming to us for opportunities. Does that make sense?
Yep, it does. Thank you.
And then why don't we, Michael Billerman asked, on mall-based tenants, the percentage of our ABR with traditional mall-based tenants sounds like expanding. Would be helpful to understand percentage today, what you're trending over the next 3 to 5 years. We can get you the exact percentage, Michael. I don't have it offhand. I would just say that with some of the examples that David and the team here has mentioned, particularly with Sleep Number, Bath and Body Works, Claire's, I mean, we've dramatically increased our exposure to them. I mean, we've added 12 new Bath and Bodies just over the last couple of years. We continue to have more in the pipeline. So I think we're seeing that accelerate, and we certainly think we can grow that percentage. And as more and more retailers like the Luxotticas of the world, like the Foot Lockers of the world, continue to expand their open air footprint, I would expect us to see that number grow. We can get back to you on the exact percentage. Why don't I go to Greg next?
Hey, thanks, Brian. I just want to touch on market rents. You mentioned tenants having trouble finding space. Does that mean that maybe they're starting to get more aggressive in terms of rents that they're willing to pay? In general, just hoping that you can give us some idea in terms of what market rent might look like by geography or box type, whether there's any standout markets, and then really just trying to get a sense for whether or not rent spreads could start to accelerate.
Matt, you want to take this first, and I can jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we have seen rents grow. Unfortunately, we've seen some of the costs grow as well. I think we've been able to have some pretty honest conversations with the retailers, and there's been competition for the space. So just naturally, we've been pushing rents. There's been, it's when we have 2 or 3 tenants bidding on the same space, we're able to drive rents, I think, to a better result than 4 years ago, 3 years ago, when the centers weren't updated, when the centers didn't look as good, and there was more space available.
And you see it in the spreads, right? Where we were historically maybe trending in the 20s, the last couple of quarters, you can see our new lease spreads in the 30s, which I think reflects a lot of that increased demand.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Greg, the runway that we see to rent growth is really encouraging. I mean, we've got rents expiring, the anchor rents expiring across the portfolio in the next few years, just over $9. We've been signing those at close to 14, and competition for space is really driving that number higher. Last quarter, we signed small shop rents at the highest rents that we ever have in the portfolio. So you're seeing it on our results, and to Matt's point, competition is driving that even higher across the portfolio. So we remain confident about it long term.
And just a quick follow-up there, because you did mention the costs. So when you're seeing kind of the rents go from $9 to $14, how much of that is eaten up by kind of increased costs right now?
Well, I think if you look at our net effective rents, I mean, the team's done a great job of holding costs in line, and we report those to give everybody an idea of what our ultimate spend is. I think is to Matt's point, though, we are seeing it across the portfolio. What we've been able to do in a number of circumstances, and I brought that up earlier when Matt answered the question, because I sat in a meeting with him and he was able to walk out of the meeting with a 15% increase in rent to move a deal forward. Retailers recognize what's been happening, and we've been able to have really honest conversations with them regarding scope and regarding rate. And so in every case, it's not that the rent's automatically going up, but they can work with the loading dock. They can keep the bathrooms in the same place. They can keep the facade as is. So we're having those discussions, and they're doing it because they ultimately want the store, and they want the store as quickly as they can get it. So we have seen instances where costs have gone up for sure, but I think the team's done a fantastic job of being able to work that into the economics of the transaction.
In addition to the net effective rents, Greg, also look at what we're doing in terms of the reinvestment yields, and we've been able to hold our yields through driving better rent.
Thank you.
Thanks. Alex, why don't we go to you?
Great. Great. Thank you. 2 questions. For me. One is, it sounds like from the comments, others who've spoken with, and you guys coming out of ICSC, that the demand from the tenant side for space is, insatiable, which is awesome. At the same time, we read articles about the consumer, gas prices, inflation, and it's just hard to think that, consumers won't pull back at all, or that the tenants themselves aren't concerned that for all their demand to grow space, that there's a concern that, maybe the customer will push back. Is there anything that you guys heard from tenants, or is there any areas that people are concerned about, or is this really this wonderful nirvana where everything is going the right way and there's not a crack or cloud to be seen?
Well, I'd love for Tanya and David to jump in here. I would just say, to start, something that David mentioned is that there are concerns, but that the store is still the most profitable way to deliver goods to the consumer. And they're certainly, with shipping costs where they are, it's not getting any cheaper to just go directly online. And what we've done across the portfolio with accommodating BOPUS for not just large format retailers and for grocers, we've done it with the likes of most of our junior box tenants that have wanted it, like the Ultas of the world. I think that has become more commonplace with the general consumer. So there's certainly concerns. It's just, as they look to continue to distribute goods to the consumer, the most profitable way to do it is within the store. And so they're investing in their existing store fleet, and they're expanding their footprints as well to be able to do that. Tanya, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, there's definitely an acknowledgement of that as an issue, and most of the outparcel tenants are, like you just said, they're investing in things like pre-buying fixtures, renegotiating with their vendors. They are shrinking their footprint of their building, however, increasing the parcel size. So for us, we're still getting the increased rent and the same, we're still leasing the same thing, the parcel, but they're saving some costs by doing a smaller footprint. And the other thing is investment in technology. There's especially in the QSR, fast casual food arena, is automation. I mean, they're having to deal with that to bring down costs and to deal with the labor
But
situation.
Tanya, you're not seeing or hearing any of the retailers say, we're worried about our customers' ability to continue to spend.
No, well, only in the sense that they're not they're responding with price increases, but they're being very cautious. The food retailers are being very cautious at how much they increase because of that concern. So yes, they're acknowledging that may be something. So the answer is not just to increase costs. They've got to, increase prices. They've got to do it elsewhere.
Okay, and then the second question is, clearly you guys aren't urban, so you don't have, the same quality of life crime issues, but still, there are unfortunately, the growing thefts that occur. There's homelessness that occurs. We hear from the urban landlords and the retailers how that impacts their stores, the appointment or shopping by appointment and such. Are you seeing any impact in your portfolio, or how do you guys manage in some of your denser populations to make sure that, the center stays clean, respectable, attractive, and that doesn't, take on, whatever the local issues are that are going on in some local markets that they don't take on in your center?
Security is a huge issue for tenants, and we're being responsive to that through lighting, through remote monitoring, through additional security at our centers to make sure that we don't experience some of the problems that particularly some of the more urban locations have experienced. We have active programs to partner with local law enforcement to deal with issues such as homelessness. We're partnering with the communities to address that. But it's a very important issue. We think it's a relative advantage, Alex, in terms of the nature of our locations. Typically don't experience the same levels of crime and security issues that you see in denser, more urban locations. But it's something that we're on top of because it's one of the retailers' foremost concerns. They want to make sure they're providing the consumer with a very safe shopping experience. And again, there are multiple ways that we deal with it, partnering better with the community, remote monitoring, off-duty police presence, lighting, et cetera, to ensure that the center remains safe.
Thank you.
You bet.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Jim. We want to take a question from Mark Phillips in the chat. Are you signing leases with higher escalators based on CPI to mitigate higher inflation? David, why don't I hand that to you? This is a particular focus point for our head of national accounts.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer to that question is yes, absolutely. Retailers across the board have been more open to larger increases in not only base rent, but reimbursements for pass-throughs. It's a conversation we're having across the board. They're aware of the inflationary environment we're in, and they're aware that their rent needs to grow over time. I don't think we've run into challenges with any of them on it.
Yeah, and I would just add, particularly from a local and regional perspective, and particularly in Matt's part of the world too, we've been able to push upwards of kind of 4% annual increases sometimes with smaller tenants. I mean, if you look across our portfolio, inclusive of our anchor space, we're averaging close to 2% annual escalators, the average across the term of the lease. So from that perspective, I think the team's done a really good job focusing on that. And then to David's point, we've also been laser focused from an OpEx standpoint as well, in terms of tenants that may have historically had caps on the growth in their OpEx spending. We've been focused on removing those out of the gate as well. And tenants have been receptive of that. And they've been receptive of it, not just because of inflation, because they recognize what we're spending in our centers, and our centers look a lot better as well. Thanks, David. Why don't we go to Caitlin?
Thanks, everyone. So you talked about the interest you're seeing for now in 2023, but also going into 24. So I was wondering how you could, or if you could compare that to the past. Are you planning further in advance or closer to opening dates, or is it similar to the past? And ultimately, I'm just wondering if that downtime between users ends up getting smaller or staying about the same.
Yeah, I'd say it depends on the use. So what Tanya was talking about for out parcels in particular, sometimes you have a kind of a longer lead time on those spaces, or to Matt's point earlier, when we're thinking about when we might get an office supply box back in a couple of years, we've been negotiating those out a bit. I think from a time frame perspective, our team's been laser focused on reducing time frames, whether that's through our short form lease or partnering with tenants from a build out perspective. I don't see the fact that we're looking out to 24 in terms of really extending those times. If anything, is going to tighten them, because we'll have a tenant in place when we ultimately get that space back, and we'll already have done a lot of the hard work around permitting that space so that we're ready to put hammers in the wall as soon as we get possession of the space back. One of the deals that Matt's been working on for an office supply box that's coming back to us early next year, we're going to be ready to start, and downtime will just be a couple months versus what normally would be a few months on top of that because of the permitting process. So getting ahead of those spaces, I think it's indicative of the environment in terms of overall box availability. The tenants are willing to look out, and it kind of puts us at a bit of an advantage. And once we get the space back, we already have the tenant in place.
Thanks.
Thank you, Caitlin. Why don't we go to Linda?
In terms of getting some of the highest rents you've ever seen, do you have a sense of what kind of occupancy cost ratios that small shop retailers themselves are comfortable with? Is it something that gets brought up during the lease negotiations?
Yeah, for sure. And I think if you look at the types of users that are driving some of those rents, and going back to that slide and where we've been signing, who we've been signing deals with, some of those service operators, medical, they can afford to pay higher rents. Some of the restaurant operators can afford to pay higher occupancy costs. As it relates to franchise uses, I mean, they're able to afford the rents because they're driving the sales out of those locations. So we are getting more sales reporting across the portfolio. Historically, open air hasn't gotten as much sales data as they have from as we have in the malls, but you're seeing that a lot more the last few years from an open air perspective. But I think overall, the nature of the tenants that we're signing deals with are driving a lot of those occupancy costs higher, and they can afford to do it because the traffic is coming to the center and they're able to perform at volumes that are enabling them to pay that rent.
And then just one follow-up. You mentioned that retailers are still filling their open to buy store openings for 2023. If the retailers pull back at all, how does this get communicated to landlords? One thing we heard at ICSC is sometimes there's a lag effect between the field guys and corporate headquarters.
Well, and again, I'd love to, David or Matt, Tanya, to jump in here too. I mean, most of the conversations that we're having right now, the leases that we're signing with national tenants, there are some that we're still looking to open in 2022, but particularly because of the build out times and permitting, we're looking into 2020. So we're negotiating those deals today. So a lot of that would have to stop soon. And that's not what we heard, right? What we heard last week and what we saw in the first quarter and we talked about in our pipeline is continued robust demand from a lot of our core tenants. So we don't necessarily see that. And the fact that they're talking about 2024 gives us some additional confidence in that as well. And generally, just from a retailer standpoint, when they take a deal into committee, that triggers funds, right? That triggers a spending on the lease, that triggers spending on plans. So they start to get committed to the deals and both from a time and capital standpoint to move forward. So we have pretty good visibility as we look out to 23.
Thanks.
Matt, David, you want to chime in on that at all?
Yeah, I'll add one thing there quick, Linda. You mentioned the possible disconnect between corporate and the field. We've developed incredible partnerships with our retailers, and we have those partnerships not only with the field people, but with the executive level and the C-suites. And we have open communications. And I, for the most part, would think that if they're thinking about reducing any of those numbers or have a chance of not moving forward with a deal, we'll know about it pretty quickly.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the deals with the retailers we're at least with today. It's, as I mentioned, a couple of them they want to be the backup. So we have backup tenants who want these spaces. I think Craig mentioned it before, but that's really nice. It's a really nice position to be in, to have one or two backups behind some of these box deals coming out of ICSC.
Tanya, do you have anything to add on that?
No, essentially the same thing. I think sometimes we know because of what David said, maybe before the region does, as to maybe some pullbacks on individual deals or just growth in general because of that constant contact with the executives and upper management.
Thanks.
Great, thanks, Linda. Why don't we head to Flores?
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I had two questions. Well, one of the things that struck me as I was walking around to ICSC and I went into a bunch of the booths is the information that you get from cell phone data users. And maybe if you guys could talk about that, because I think one of the things that malls can point to that, it's hard to refute is particularly A malls, is the high sales volumes, right? And that ultimately retailers are in there, they want to have a store to have high sales volumes. Hard to compete when you don't have sales volume data in your centers. You say you're getting more of that, but you now actually track, how many people visit your centers or how many people go by and how long they stay in the dwell times and things like that. So how does that help you relative to some of the private owners and also relative to some of the competing malls near your properties?
It makes us a lot smarter. And when we go into a discussion with tenants, both from when we're pitching a site and when we're talking about existing locations, because not only do we track who's coming to our center and how often they're coming and where they're coming from, we also track how that store compares to foot traffic in the MSA, how it compares to foot traffic in the state, how it compares to foot traffic across the chain. So while we may not have that sales data, and to David's point, him and his team have developed incredible, and Tanya as well, have developed incredible relationships with tenants. So we're able to get a lot of that data. But we also have, we can say, look, what we're seeing is traffic is up X at the center, or since we put this grocer in, your traffic is increased by Y, or your traffic, here's how it compares to other parts of the market. What we also can do is historically, it's been a 1-3-5 mile ring of what you've talked about for your demos. Well, now we have custom trade areas, and you'll see that a lot on our marketing flyers where we can say, look, here's who's shopping our center. Here's where they're coming from, and here's the voids that are in this specific trade area. We also have some tools that show the overlap between a tenant's existing store and what it would be had they come to our center. And we can see, look, from a traffic overlap perspective, this looks like a void. And retailers have their own research departments. We're really fortunate here that we've got David Spawn, who oversees our research team, who came from a retailer, who connects with those his retailer counterparts. But what this also gives us is the lean, right? So they can go back to their research departments if for some reason it didn't show up as a hole for them, or something that was on what they call maybe a prescription list. We can go back and say, hey, did you consider this? Did you look at how the center is trading? And so it's really given us a leg up, and we continue to use it. We've continued to add additional tools. The tools we have today are a lot better than they were 12 months ago. They're light years ahead of where they were 5 years ago when we first started using this stuff. So it's been pretty exciting and encouraging. But if I had to sum it up, it just makes us a lot smarter.
Great. And maybe if you
just,
oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead. I was going to add, though, that also our research people and tenants research departments are speaking the same language now. We're using the same data and learning how each of us are manipulating that, where before we were on different pages. The tenants had all of this data that we weren't privy to, nor did they share. Now it's a common language, and they want to work with us on that, where before in the past it was more of a struggle, whether you're on the mall side or the open air side.
Maybe my follow-up question, if I could ask one more, is, obviously there's a lot of pent-up demand still, it appears, and you continue to build you're filling as quickly as you're leasing, so your sign not open, is basically staying fairly constant as you add more new leases. Curious, how long does the current demand from the retailers need to last before rents rise high enough where they're above replacement cost, i.e. because we've had basically a decade of no new construction in retail, things appear to be turning a corner. At what point do you start to think about, well, geez, there could be some new construction down the pike because rents have, it's a nice problem to have because it means rents have to rise above current levels, but at what point does that become an issue?
Florence, it's a great question. And, to date, we have not seen much new supply. And part of that is that, ground up development still underwrites to 5 to 6% returns on cost. And, you're seeing increased costs, increased land prices driving some of that. And you think about the risk profile of that return, that's a pretty difficult, risk reward situation. So, just using your simple math, you'd like to see those returns drift up into the 7s, which would imply, increases in rents from a market perspective, 15 to 20% above where they are today, to justify that type of risk taking in that environment. Now, we're in an unusual time because typically, you'd be facing a significant amount of new supply. We just haven't seen it. And I think it's going to take more than a couple of years for that to ramp up, not only given where yields need to be, but also permitting and locations that will attract retailers. I mean, the retailers like to go to a proven, established location where they can measure traffic, to your first question, and can get to a better idea of where their sales are going to be. I think it's different than where it was in the 2000s, where you had a number of shopping centers being built chasing new rooftops, and retailers were willing to kind of take the bet that the customer would come and that the rooftops would bring the demand that they need. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're a couple of years away from that at a minimum.
Thanks, guys.
Great, thanks, Floris. Why don't we go to Anthony?
Thanks. Yeah. Could you walk us through maybe the psychology of a retailer like Burlington or Ross, who are seeing as near-term softness in their sales, but continue to go ahead with their plans according to what you've seen? Are they just building up? Are they just, picking up for lost time? Are they, really just seeing these stores are very important that they need to open up despite the near-term uncertainty? What gives them the, confidence or the willingness to go ahead with their plans, given what they're seeing in their own numbers?
Yeah, I think two different cases, and I'd love David to chime in here as well. As it relates to Burlington, they've shrunk their footprint, right? You had historically some of these larger stores, 70, 80,000 square feet, where we've been the beneficiary of downsizing them in multiple cases and adding a Sprouts grocer or another off-price retailer. And so their footprint's gotten smaller into, call it 20, 25,000 square feet. So now they've seen more of an infill opportunity and the ability to relocate some of those stores to get to prototypes. So I still think there's runway there for them to be able to do that. And also as a landlord, with fewer of those big stores than we had before, but a few of them, we have the opportunity to be able to put them in the right position in place and accretively backfill it again to add a special grocer or another use. As it relates to Ross, they're opening up new markets, right? So they're pushing into the Midwest. We've got good activity with them in places like Ohio and Michigan. They're pushing into North Jersey as well. So I think from a market share standpoint, both of them are unique in terms of where they're looking to grow. David, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, you covered most of it. I'd only add to the Ross part where while there's some negativity in their last report, it's coming off of endless quarters of positive comps, right? And to Brian's point, they have tons of white space. Their stores make a lot of money, and they have room to grow. And they're still filling that runway.
Thanks. Maybe one more. How are real-time traffic trends at the stores? We've heard people talk about more experiences versus kind of shopping. What are you seeing on the traffic trend? Anything to pull out there?
We continue to trend above where we were in 2019, which we find very encouraging. If some folks have done some comparative analysis of relative traffic levels, and we look even better there because of the investments we've made in our portfolio, and you're seeing that really result in higher traffic levels. So it's encouraging to us on both fronts, both sort of macro, but also the traffic changes that we're seeing in the centers that we've invested in.
Thank you.
You bet.
Great, thanks. Why don't we head to Mike Mueller?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Talked about a strong demand picture for national and regional tenants, but when you look at the true local tenants, is anything less robust there, just given higher financing costs, cost to open stores, and just concerns over a recession?
We haven't seen the slowdown at all. I mean, in terms of our pace in the committee is higher than it was last year. It's higher than it was in 2019. You saw small business applications in 2021 reach a record. And if anything, Mike, just as we saw with some of our national tenants that emerged stronger, a lot of the local and regional players have emerged that stronger from the pandemic. We specifically see that from a restaurant perspective, where you had strong restaurant operators that were able to navigate a challenging 2020 into 2021, and were able to take advantage of the fact that there were some second generation restaurant space to be able to come in and open locations. The franchisee profile, which we would also consider kind of in the local tenant mix, has gotten stronger as well. You've had multiple multi-unit franchisees that are taking on more. So our team's partnered with Angela's group to really dig into the financials. Our underwriting process is a lot tighter than it was coming out of the pandemic. And what we see is a stronger credit profile for local tenants. And we also see as we've been making this investment, our centers look better. We've been adding stronger anchors, and we're getting a higher quality of local and regional tenants. So to date, we haven't seen as much of a slowdown really at all. I mean, Matt, I turn it to you first, and then maybe Tanya, you've been dealing with a lot of regional restaurant concepts as well in the out parcel space. I don't know if there's anything you could add.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but we've been able to be more selective because there's more competition for space. So credit is a big piece of that, but also, we can pick the number one pizza operator in every city and typically attract them to the center. Just being able to show, what the center looked like previously, what it looks like today, being able to show the traffic, what the traffic was like at the center before, 3 years ago, what the traffic is there today. All that data helps. And it's enabled us to grab the A or the B player in every market instead of, maybe the C player that you might have been stuck with at one point. And that's great. I mean, a lot of these local operators are frankly better than some of the national guys. They're into it. Some of the local pizza operators I'd prefer over the national pizza operators or sandwich chains. So it's really on a case by case basis, but I think it's let us be very decisive on merchandise mix and credit at the centers, which helps add even more traffic.
Thanks.
Great, Matt. Tanya, anything to add on that from your end?
Really just what you mentioned, Brian, as far as, a lot of the restaurants and local franchise, what used to be more local franchisees are the survivors. I mean, they figured out how to navigate 2020. We've taken a deeper dive on, evaluating their credit and finances, as we should. And we're dealing with those tenants that we feel like are going to really be the right choice, as Matt indicated. So especially these multi-tenant buildings, we may take back a more dated concept, full service sit down restaurant, scrape that and build a multi-tenant building and put a, credit Chipotle and a credit, Starbucks or Aspen Dental. And then you have that luxury to put in a local tenant that might be, just draw that local community and to complement the nationals. So it's been refreshing.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks, Mike. Why don't I take a question from the Q&A here from Brian Spawn, who asked about where the watch list is today, preliminary signs of stress, and what we're watching for on looming recession risk. I'd say overall the watch list is down. We feel a lot better about our underlying credit profile than we did heading into the pandemic. Many of the retailers that emerged are more well capitalized. Coming out, they were able to push out some debt maturities, refinance their debt. There were the retailers that did ultimately go away. We've already taken that space back. As we've talked about on prior calls, move outs are down considerably. There still are specific tenants that we're watching. I won't get into individual names, but I would just say our rents on those boxes and spaces continue to be low, and with the demand that we're seeing, to the extent we get a box or two back, we feel like we can backfill those very accretively. Movie theaters have been on our watch list a bit. We've seen some great trends so far in terms of some blockbuster movies. It's a very low percentage of our ABR. It's less than 2% of what we have, but we've been seeing some really encouraging trends there. But overall, I mean, it's something that we stay on top of, and to the point we were talking about earlier in terms of looking out a few years, 2023, 2024, to the extent we can take even a box back today where there's an opportunity to do that from a category that's a bit challenged, we're going to do that. And we've done that numerous times with office supply tenants. So our team, particularly with how tight demand is, we've been really focused on making sure that we're marketing spaces we think we may get back. Angela, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you framed it up really well, Brian. I think, we look at the watch list we had going into the pandemic, as Brian said, we had fallout, especially in 2020. We really haven't had any bankruptcies to speak of in 21 or 22. And a lot of the tenants that were on the watch list that didn't go through bankruptcies in 2020 either had operational improvements in their business, sort of structural tailwinds in their business, and many of them, had the opportunity to recapitalize. So the watch list continues to feel really good. I would say, I think this has come up, in several of the comments that have been made already, but, some of the off-price meetings in particular I was sitting in on at the conference, we heard we've got these big plans, 23, 24. We don't know where the boxes are going to come from. They're looking at occupancy across the sector as pretty full, in terms of 94, 95, 96% anchor occupancy. And we don't know how we're going to actually meet those plans if there's not tenant distress somewhere that frees up some additional boxes. So I think that commentary was just really interesting as well in terms of the speed with which particularly some of the anchor boxes could be scooped up in 23 or 24 if there is some tenant distress, but we certainly don't see anything imminent on the horizon.
Great, thanks, Angela. Why don't we go to Chris?
Yeah, thanks. It's great to see the team down. Thanks for hosting that Monday night. I wanted to follow up on Forrest's question and just really understand the implications of some of your comments around BOPIS and maybe e-commerce a little bit. You mentioned now that some of the data that you're collecting on the cell phone side is allowing you to have, consistent communication on terms of the data the retailers have. How is that translating into some of your ability to capture the omni-channel effect and maybe, the omni-channel effect the retailers are experiencing, maybe push rents a little bit with some of that data?
Yeah, I think from an omni-channel perspective, what we're finding is looking at investments in the store, looking at, they're adding curbside pickup, they're repositioning the store to be able to ship from store. And I think you're hearing their analysis when they look to both add a store, if they're going to relocate, is what's the impact on other stores from a distribution standpoint. I don't know that we're necessarily tracking the actual deliveries, but we're able to have a holistic sense of the conversation with the tenants in terms of what investment did they make in the store recently, the type of tenant that's utilizing BOPIS, and then ultimately what those traffic trends are if we don't get sales. I mean, as I mentioned, David, Tanya do a fantastic job from a national standpoint of getting this information from tenants as partners that ultimately we have a sense across the portfolio of how they're doing, even though they don't ultimately report. And I think part of that is having a lot of that traffic data. So I think the key for us from an omni-channel perspective is as much, okay, we've been able to allow BOPIS to a wider range of tenants because we got really big parking fields. It's only a handful of spaces, and it's effectively no cost to us. And we've seen more of those junior boxes avail themselves of the opportunity to do that. And then within the store, right, as we're building some of these out, there's a certain percentage of the store that's going towards ship from store distribution, a smaller percentage, but it's still in the context of the overall store layout. So I think that gives us a sense of how the store overall is performing and gives us a leg up in those discussions.
I guess as a follow-up to that, like shipping from the store, are you hearing any commentary from retailers maybe wanting less space or building out the back of the space to kind of meet that online last mile fulfillment? And was that part of any conversations during your meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a footprint perspective, we're seeing that 20 to 22,000 square foot space be the kind of the sweet spot from an off-price perspective. They don't need as much of that for delivery. We are finding that some retailers like Target are getting bigger, right? They want the sales floor and they want the distribution space as well. So I think it's a bit of a mix. Somebody like an Ulta really hasn't changed the overall footprint of the store, but they may have shrunk the sales floor a little bit and may have more space for ship from store abilities. But it hasn't, I'd say it's been a mixed bag overall. And it's generally within our discussions. And when retailers do it themselves from a remodel perspective, it's not at a cost to the landlord.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Chris. Can we go to Tammy, maybe?
Yes, hi, thank you. I was curious, you showed a chart on the mix of small shop, new lease ABR, and I guess I just wanted to get a sense for if your small shop category mix is changing in your portfolio, or if there are like notably stronger or weaker demand in, particular categories versus maybe historical trends.
Yeah, can we pull that up first? Jack, would you pull that up real quick? You have it? Yeah, so we had, even coming into the pandemic, Tammy, we had seen a significant amount of demand from service, restaurant, and boutique fitness. I'd say we have had a pickup, to David's point, in the footwear category, whether that's Skechers, Foot Locker, Rally House. I mean, Rally House is more kind of a sport example, but we've certainly seen an increase from the footwear tenants in terms of kind of traditional dry retail. But if service, there was a little bit of slowdown there during the pandemic. We had seen a significant pickup of that since. And restaurants continue to be, I think, from a driver standpoint on the small shop space, we continue to have a significant amount of demand from restaurants. And what's generally happening there and how that shifted a bit is, before, anchor tenants may say, look, I don't want the restaurant right next door, or I want them a certain different distance away. That distance has shrunk dramatically. And if you would sit with the heads of real estate at one of the off-price operators specifically said, when he gave us a Panera consent, that's my customer, right? I'm going to let you have that closer to my store than I would have before. As David, Tanya, and Matt are negotiating leases, we've been able to get much more flexibility in terms of our ability to put service and even boutique fitness. They still, for the largest fitness guys, want them a little bit further away, but even that, we've done some downside deals with larger retailers where we've been able to put a Planet Fitness next door. One of the projects that Matt just completed in Naples, we've got a Planet Fitness right next to a Home Goods and a Burlington. That would have been a challenge 5 years ago. And I think from that receptivity, I think that's changed a bit in terms of our ability to merchandise our small shops to these types of uses without as much of an impact on parking.
Got it. Thank you. And then can you just remind us what % of your portfolio is currently on fixed CAM? And are you making any notable changes in your leases today related to CAM, just given the inflationary environment?
It's a great question. It's roughly 23% of the portfolio is on fixed CAM today. And generally those escalators are around, on average around 4%. The bulk of those tenants, are small shop tenants where there is ultimately a reset and kind of a fully loaded CAM number. So we feel pretty good about where that sits. I think David and Tanya, from a national tenant perspective, have really done a great job with CAM caps. And as we're seeing leases, like Tanya mentioned, those leases that are coming back to us 15, 20 years old, to the extent we're resetting those leases, we're getting rid of those CAM caps. We're bringing that CAM to market. And from a reset perspective, we have the ability to go back in and look at that. I think our tenants recognize what we've been doing at our shopping centers, so it's been an easier discussion, but it's something that we've been laser focused on, both in renewal and new lease discussions. We're a little bit, to the extent we are not able to get a high percentage escalator from a fixed CAM perspective in this environment, we're a little hesitant to lock that in from a national perspective. But overall, I think the team's done a nice job balancing that across the portfolio. David, Tanya, do you have anything to add there?
I think you covered it all there, Brian. Perfectly.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. And why don't we go? Oh, Michael had one here in the chat. We talked about, I mentioned no tenants you met with, talked about closing stores. Yeah. Can you speak to how retailers are adjusting their inline to serve e-commerce, moving walls, and giving up some space to shrink their stores, improve four wall? We talked a little bit about that. David, anything that I didn't hit on relative to store layouts and prototypes that came up in your meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on this before also with the fact that it varies depending on retailer, but we are talking to them about it. I think the more the more I hear from retailers is on changes they're making to support e-com are not inside of the box. Like they're using their existing stock rooms to do fulfillment out of the store. They are making changes outside of the box, which we've talked about a lot lately as it relates to BOPUS, right? Buy online, pick up in store. We're partnering with them to get dedicated parking spaces for it. The consumer wants it. It's part of the omni-channel approach that the consumer demands today. And it's been, they saw a real success with it during the pandemic. And that's something that we think is here to stay.
I would add a slight nuance or that's different on the fast food drive-through sector is tenants that historically did not have drive-throughs, they're converting to having a drive-through, but in addition to that is the concept of a pickup window. So you have some tenants that are changing their prototype to allow for pickups and drive-throughs. Tropical Smoothie is one of them, where they're opening up stores where on one side of the store is a drive-through, the other side is a pickup window. And then there's some that are just pickup windows only. So just a lot of innovation in the prototypes to address that changing environment and that in the way that consumer, you know, interacts with picking their food up at a fast food or fast casual restaurant.
And size too. Some of those guys have gone as small as 1,000 feet, 800 feet to fit into some of the room that we didn't think that we had, or we didn't think that we could fit an out parcel. They're getting creative to find space in an 800-foot building.
Great point, Matt. There is a lot of new coffee tenants that are emerging, some of them regional and established, some of them new, and they'll take 900 square feet with a drive-through, sometimes a double drive-through. So it is, yeah, it's densifying our site in areas that are shopping centers in areas that we never thought we could.
Awesome, thanks. Alex, I think you have another question. There.
Yeah, it was actually just on the drive-through. Forgive me on the food analogy, but yeah, Sicilian pizza, everyone wants a quarter, right? No one seems to want the inside piece of a Sicilian. You take a shopping center, and by definition, there are only a certain number of spots you can put a drive-through. Then you have to get the local authorities, the fire department, zoning, you know, as a lot of the local folks know here, Westchester County loves to, drag things out, and probably a lot of your markets the same. Same with, I'm assuming, a titling out parcel. So is there a way to sort of create more drive-throughs? Are tenants willing to share a drive-through, meaning that you could have tenants who each have access to a drive-through point or a common area? Like, what are ways to drum up more drive-throughs, given that by definition, there are only so many you can have, and yet everyone wants them? I mean, certainly we all know Chick-fil-A, it looks like the Tappan Zee Bridge at rush hour. Everyone's backed up trying to get their chicken sandwich. So what's a way to increase, just given the physical limitations?
Go ahead, Tanya, why don't you take that?
A couple of different things to tackle there. One, from the entitlement side, the municipalities, even the more difficult ones like, Westchester County and a lot of the municipalities in California, they embraced drive-throughs in 2020. In early 2021, wanted to do everything they could to actually accommodate them. But that quickly did evolve into wanting to figure out a way to not tax a shopping center and or the infrastructure, the roads within a community, bringing back to your point that now everybody's really focused on the efficiencies of them. So it does limit the number of pads that you can do. Tenants like Chick-fil-A they're, like I said, shrinking their footprint in some instances, but increasing their out parcel size so they can contain it all on one parcel. So it does not actually impact or to be a stress on the shopping center or the municipality. As far as sharing drive-throughs, the only way where we have seen that is if it's under the same banner, the same parent company. So for instance, Focus Brand or Inspire, where they'll consider doing an Auntie Anne's and a Jamba Juice and one of their other concepts, and they'll use to share sometimes back of house and drive-through. But Chipotle and Starbucks sharing a drive-through, we haven't seen that yet, or we've not been successful in that. Brian, I don't know if you want to Specialty leasing is working on a few things, but more of a pickup, one centralized location for pickup, but that's more associated with DoorDash and those types of companies versus the actual end user, the end tenant.
Yeah, and I think what you've seen, while they're not sharing drive-through necessarily, Alex, Tanya's worked on plenty of deals where we've got a multi-tenant out parcel building, right? And we've got the end cap on the drive-through, and it kind of wraps around those two other locations. And what you saw, some of the logos on the chart there, whether it's Crumble Cookies or whether it's America's Best, we do have some uses that can co-tenant very nicely with like a tropical smoothie type user who might want the drive-through on the end cap, or a Chipotle who might want the drive-through on the end cap. So we're still in a lot of cases where we see that demand able to add the density, and then we can kind of make the decision, do we want a single tenant drive-through user, or do we want to be able to move forward because the rents are demanding it? Do we want to be able to move forward with a multi-tenant out parcel building there where we can accommodate a drive-through and then a handful of other retailers? So it's something that we're certainly looking at.
A pizzeria
And
can't charge more for the corner slice, Alex. We can.
Hey.
Good point. And there's other, I don't know if I'd call it drive-through, but categories of very strong credit in the auto category. So Mr. Car Wash, a huge private company, and Valvoline, for instance, we're negotiating with them, if not actually doing deals with them, that it's not a QSR drive-through. However, they will take space that we didn't think it was even marketable, or it's what is perceived to be the back of a shopping center, and they're desperate for it. So we do see some opportunities like that we did not see 3 years ago. So that's another category we really haven't discussed, but is strong out parcel growth.
Great, thanks, Alex. Just before, it looks like that was the last question. Does anybody else have any? Either from the crowd or from who's on the screen? Nope. Well, look, thanks everybody. This is something that we really look forward to every year. Our team puts a tremendous amount of work into ICSC. I encourage all of you to look on our social media channels. You can see the pictures from the booth, the activity from the booth. And as I mentioned at the start, this group has a tremendous amount to follow up on. So look forward to seeing all of that follow up and to sharing some of that with you all as well in the future. But we appreciate the opportunity for you to spend some time with David, Tanya, and Matt today, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Jim, I don't know if you have anything else to
Thanks
add.
everybody. Really well done, team.
Great. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.